and welcome to How I Am I. I am Lucinda Koza, and I am joined today by a very accomplished, very brilliant, very impressive guest. And I would like her to introduce herself and give a bit of a bio backstory, if you don't mind.
Yes, thank you for having me. My name is Dr. Lisa DeLaRue. I'm a licensed psychologist in California and serve as the Chief Education and Research Officer for a nonprofit called Urban Alchemy. I also have an affiliation with the University of San Francisco, and I have a long history of working in the intersection of trauma, addiction, and folks who are impacted by the carceral system or incarceration. And also intertwined with that, I've done a lot of work around perinatal and postnatal mental health. And so I'm excited to be here and have a conversation with you.
Awesome. I am so excited that you're here. I'm curious, of course, right off the bat, do you find do you find a lot of women who may be struggling in that fourth trimester? Do you find that they may be entering that sort of cycle that you mentioned of self-medication, or there's a unresolved trauma, there's self-medication, then there's a run-in with the incarceration. I'm saying this wrong, but that incarceration system.
Yeah.
You will say it right, so maybe you should take over that.
No, it's all kind of the systems, the broader systems, kind of people call them interchangeably carceral system, contact with the incarceration system. Tend to avoid justice system because not always justice within that system. But I think broadly, there's been a lot of lack of attention and care given to folks, either in the fourth trimester or beyond, who are parenting and who are involved or have contact. So we look at one of the most underserved group of folks that are incarcerated are women, and especially women who have children. We don't have a system that's set up to allow them to have strong and positive relationships as much with their children. We put a lot of barriers in place. And even when we think about kind of male caregivers or fathers, their access to be able to maintain relationships with children is really challenging. And so when we think about the trauma and then the mental health outcomes associated with that, there is a lack of attention to how do we support women and not look at them solely as maybe the reason why they're incarcerated, but also the long history of what brought them there. We look at particularly women, the disproportionate rate of trauma, depending on what study you're looking at, it's 80 to 90% of women who are incarcerated have a significant history of trauma, be that kind of childhood abuse, neglect, community violence, assaults, the list goes on and on. And then we know very much the intersection with addiction, which is often a way to cope with untreated kind of mental health or trauma symptoms. And then that can create a challenging cycle where folks are using to ease pain, but then needing to become in precarious situations that put them at risk for either more trauma or legal contact. And that's how we often see the cycle develop. And so when we especially think about folks who are pregnant, birthing, and then becoming parents, so much of that can trigger your own kind of unresolved childhood trauma. And a lot of the things that we didn't realize were just bubbling under the surface will come up. One be just the magnitude of bringing life right into the world and carrying that. And then throw in all the hormone mix, all of the changes in your body. And then we see folks who are struggling will be especially at risk, like before birth, which we often ignore. Most folks are more often familiar with postpartum depression, anxiety, but a lot of those symptoms arise before birth even happens. And we don't give enough attention or care to that. And then when we think about trauma, you start to think about all the ways, even subconsciously, the way you were parented, the things that you got as a child, or the things that maybe you didn't get as a child. And then now you have this awesome and humbling experience to care for another little human being, sleep deprived, your hormones a mess, your mental health kind of needing support, and you're trying to figure out how to now parent. And if you miss some of those things as a child, it becomes really hard to access them. And so that's where we see the trauma really exasperates under all of that perfect storm of conditions.
That makes perfect sense. And if you didn't get the things that you want to give your child, it's like you're reparenting yourself while parenting your child. And if you stumble, make mistakes, or you don't live up to the expectations you're setting for yourself, it's like an enormous burden, or it's a huge bar to live
Mhm.
up to. And if you didn't have a mother, then mothering yourself while mothering a child, it's just, and if you don't have support or guidance, it can be soul crushing at
Yeah.
times.
Yeah. Yeah. And I appreciate you pointing out kind of the stumbling, right? Because parenting never plans out the way you hope, and there's always mistakes. And we really talk about, are you being good enough, showing up enough, not falling into this illusion of like perfect parenting. But that idea of stumbling, especially for some of the folks that kind of we support and work with, when you're coming out of maybe contact with carceral system, maybe you were incarcerated yourself, you already have that stigma, that label around you. And this idea that you messed up, or this stereotypes around the type of person or mother you are. And then so when you do stumble, which is natural part of parenting, the shame is so much more magnified because you feel like you're under a higher microscope or a more intense focus of you really have to do this really so that people don't continue to judge you as a mother. It's almost this double bind that you find yourself in.
Totally. And almost like fear, like a total fear, like someone's gonna come at any minute and take away your child and be like,
Yeah.
"You're awful. I declare you bad mother, and I'm taking your child." That's like the fear that all mothers have. Can't speak for all mothers, but yeah, if you've already been incarcerated, God, it's I just feel that, like, in the pit of my stomach, just that constant judgment or fear of being judged.
Yeah. While you're also simultaneously trying to process your own experiences, your own trauma. And as a country, we don't do a great job at providing kind of comprehensive mental health care. It's really hard to access high quality mental health care. So when you have folks who are already facing so many systematic barriers and then needing really high quality support to process what they've experienced, to have that experience of traumatic growth, right? Because we know folks can have a different chapter in their life, but straddling that and also parenting and the combination of reparenting can sometimes feel very overwhelming for folks and isolating. And we don't do a good enough job enough, no matter the person, uplifting and acknowledging the struggles of parenting and the difficulty, and allowing folks the grace to make mistakes and not come with judgment or ideas on what they should have done differently. And so, when you have folks who are also facing additional stigmas, becomes a real challenge. And I think even for dads as a society, we have historically disenfranchised men and dads in parenting a little bit. And so
Yes.
this assumption that they can't or they shouldn't, or that their involvement isn't as important in some spaces hasn't been fully recognized and supported. And I think we definitely see that jails, prisons, all of those spaces aren't conducive to children, families. They have not been set up. There's ways you could do it better for sure, but they have not been set up to facilitate the strengthening of family bonds. And so, especially when you see men who have been incarcerated, they're also not supported in being able to really strengthen family bonds. And of course, folks figure out how to do it. The intuition of prisons and jails and all of that. Folks figure out how to build those bonds. But as a society, we are just now, I think, entering into a realization that both men, women, whatever parents are present for the children, need to really be empowered to be a part of the entire child rearing process. And I think for men, there's been a lack of welcoming, really, in some spaces. If we think about the dynamics at schools or at daycares or other childcare systems, they're not always thinking the entire family unit first. Has been a historical tendency to over rely on the mother, the female identified caregiver, whoever that may be, and not being as inclusive for the entire parenting unit.
I there's almost in some areas, like in my personal situation, there's like an overcompensation that sort of has the same effect. Like my husband takes our son to swim lessons and he's only dad. Like I roll and of course he just always gets a "Oh my gosh, you're a dad here with your son." That's also alienating.
Yeah.
And then, my mother will just fawn over, "Oh, you're so involved. That's so great. That's so not what I had." And it is that it has somehow it is just as alienating.
Yeah.
It's like highlighting the whatever, the
Yeah. This is not the norm, or it's so interesting that you're in this space, or just highlighting the otherness of it.
yes.
Yeah.
It's like saying, "Oh, is daddy babysitting?"
Yeah. I don't babysit my own child. Thank you.
Oh, man. So is it a nonprofit?
Yeah. Urban Alchemy is a nonprofit, and we are located in numerous cities: San Francisco, LA, Portland, Austin, Birmingham right now. And what we do is really focus on building up safe communities, safe housing, and that looks different in a lot of different spaces. So, for some kind of areas we're in, we're really focused on kind of community outreach, building relationships with folks, especially folks who are experiencing homelessness. And that can include the day to day of helping sweep or clean up, but it's mostly about building relationships. And so our practitioners, who we call our employees, work in the same areas generally. And so they really get to build relationships with the folks around them, the folks who are unhoused and the folks who are on their daily commute or going to school. And it's really about coming back to that time where we know who was part of our neighbors, our neighborhoods, who was in our community. We know their name, building relationships and building support, and then providing resources when folks kind of want to access addiction or mental health treatment. How can we support them in navigating those services? We also operate what are traditionally thought of as like homeless shelters, but we really see them as holistic and wellness centers. So, shelters for folks who are experiencing homelessness, of course, but moving beyond just providing 3 meals and a cot and really providing kind of therapeutic services, addiction treatment, because that's another space where the experiences of trauma, right, are so rampant. And so providing comprehensive mental health care as best we can and building out that addiction treatment, harm reduction treatment on site. And then we also have programs that are called different things in different cities, Heart, Circle, Love, but those are kind of crisis response alternative to police responding. And that allows us, if somebody's in a crisis, 911 calls are diverted to our folks, and we respond either with kind of mental health care, case coordinating, kind of de escalation techniques, whatever's needed, and are there to provide a law enforcement response to folks who are experiencing a crisis and supporting them and de escalating, coming down, and then seeing, okay, what needs, where do they need to go? Sometimes it's hospitalization, sometimes it's connecting to resources, whatever that person needs. And so that's our mission. And our workforce is predominantly made up of folks who have what we call live expertise. And those are folks who have been formerly incarcerated. Some of them are former long term offenders. But the crux of it is folks who have experienced a lot of trauma and had that post traumatic growth, who have experienced homelessness, addiction, community violence, all of the above, and have learned from that experience and have the unique skill set to support other folks who might be in similar situations. So, that idea of these are folks who have really embraced post traumatic growth, and they are the experts that can then help other people that are on that journey.
That is brilliant. I think in many ways, your interview made me realize what my work is really about. I gave birth to twins 3 months early,
Okay.
and it was really scary and really traumatic,
Yeah.
and I was like a and it's so they were in the NICU for 3 months, and I was just like this walking, like, gutted ghost, like, holding my guts, and and then one day I realized, like, I have to be their mother.
Yeah.
Like, I have to be their mother.
Yeah. When
Like,
you're
they don't
still,
yeah, like, I can't be this I have to and it can't be fake, like, it can't be put on.
yeah.
Like, I have to be Lucinda, their mother,
Yeah.
and it was that that growth was it was the most shocking period of growth that I've ever
Mhm.
experienced, and it all just seemed to it was like I just realized I had to do it, and then it just and, like, it just happened,
Yeah.
and that's what I'm interested in is people who have done that.
Yeah. I think so much too of what you're saying is when you have to show up and mother, especially in those early days and under those circumstances, so much of it is that fight or flight, sometimes freeze response. You're just on autopilot. You're trying to get through it and you're really not having the time, the space, anything to process like the trauma your body went through, the scariness of kind of the premature and all of those months in a hospital and what that does for you and for your family. And so I think there's a lot of times where that fourth trimester or whatever can extend years later. It's not uncommon for mothers to experience significant anxiety 2, 3, 4 years after giving birth. But that is sometimes is still related to that postpartum anxiety, depression, or other mental health concerns. because you're in the thick of it and you're just kind of trying to survive the day to day, that you don't have time to process kind of everything that you've experienced. And then once you get a moment to metaphorically breathe, and it's not as intense, it's intense in a different way, right? But you have a different level of space that then all of those traumas, all of those experiences then bubble up. And so we don't fully appreciate or give folks credit that there can be a delayed onset for a lot of people.
Yeah. That's that, like, years.
Yeah.
Crazy. Yeah, people don't seem to know that.
Yeah.
So, I'm not sure I would get much support if a couple years down the road, everything came out.
Yeah. No, people wouldn't give you the same grace if it was like 3 or 4 months. Even then, people aren't. As a society, we do need to do better, but there's this idea that postpartum depression is like right after you give birth, for example, but you're not given the same credence when it comes up 2 to 3 years later, which is not uncommon.
Yeah. Yeah, there's just an enormous lack of education
Yeah. No lack of care. Amy
and, like,
Schumer, like a good book that I read, I think shortly after I gave birth, but she was talking about birthing stories. It's an edited book, and collected a bunch of birthing stories from folks. And just this acknowledgement that birth can go very relatively smooth for folks, and it can be very scary and very traumatic for many folks. And our maternal health rate and death rate is atrocious in this country. And just uplifting kind of those stories to bring out open and honest conversations about like how messy, chaotic, and like wicked birthing can be. And it can also be beautiful, right? But all of those stories along that spectrum need to be heard and valued and uplifted.
yes, absolutely, absolutely, yes, shouted from the rooftops because every turn to your left, turn to your right, there's someone who's given birth and maybe had a horribly traumatic experience and you don't even know, and it's not talked about. There's this I remember feeling like, "Why didn't my mother warn me? Like, why didn't she tell me this shit was like, pregnancy can be awful?
Yeah.
Like, why didn't she warn me about, I don't know, any of this?" This I know it's a generational thing for sure, and I'm from the South. That just doesn't help to not to
Yeah.
not tell your daughter that shit is hard.
Yeah. As a society, we don't do it. Even as maybe your girlfriends or friends, we need to tell each other a little bit more, not to scare folks, but like afterbirth is chaotic and shitty sometimes.
Yeah.
Healing journey is long and challenging.
Yeah. Yeah. And that doesn't mean about, like, how much you love your baby.
Not at all. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not a reflection on you or your character or your strength. It's just the magnitude of bringing life.
Yeah.
The more we talk about folks' experiences, and I think especially like trauma, we can help to eliminate some of that shame, some of that kind of that isolation, and really hope folks, like when we've experienced traumatic things, it's never going to be something that goes away, but we try to make it a chapter in our story, just not the current chapter as much.
Yeah. And shame. I feel like shame is the most insidious thing that you can feel.
I think people do enough blaming and shaming of themselves that we don't need to pile it on from other places as well.
Yeah,
The stigma, all of those pieces, yeah, that just make people unwilling to share, unwilling to seek help because
right.
they might be judged or criticized.
It keeps you isolated. It
Mhm.
keeps you from reaching out. It keeps you silent, and that's just it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah.
So I think it's so remarkable that so much of the workforce is people who have lived experience. That's just it should always be that way, and for you to have recognized that you weren't equipped to help some of those people, that takes a lot of awareness, and not everyone has that awareness.
I think broadly, I have this idea that people are capable of change, and that kind of covers a gamut of things like folks who have done things that maybe aren't so great, but they have the capacity for change. And just like folks who have experienced really difficult events or experiences or had traumatic childhoods or traumatic births themselves and are struggling, also have the capacity to change, right? In that way and to heal. So the idea that we can transform and we can overcome, I think, is inherent in most human nature. And so just supporting that and uplifting that and giving folks the space and the opportunity to actually realize that change, I think, is what we as a society need to do better at.
Yes. Yeah, I totally agree. Thank you so much
Yes, thank
for
you.
being here. It's been really awesome.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate you having me. It was nice speaking with you today.